What were you thinking? You suggested it. Why did you suggest it? What
Yeah,
was your
as I was reading I hope that people had a chance to read the interview, because I think the interview was it actually gives quite a bit of background on her and where she's coming from, and her motivations. And in a way, the particular piece about BIM, it kind of has some particular insights, but there's more. There's other work that she's done that's maybe more theoretically grounded, right, and might have been a little bit better to come up. But that was the one that I went with. So Peggy Deamer is based in Yale. She's also a practitioner. I think she's now retired from Yale, actually. But and as you would know from that interview, she started up this group called the Architecture Lobby, right? Which was basically, a lot of her work has been about trying to put proper value on architecture labor, by which she means the work, the work that people do in architecture offices, and trying to move away, as she describes it, from this distinction by Hannah Arendt between work and labor. That labor is the thing that's the sort of productive bit, and work is the extra bit that we do for pleasure or something like that. And she's trying to work against that distinction being made, and say that all of it is part of the same. All of it must be accounted for in some way.
right?
So her like over the past, probably decade, less than a decade, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, she's done a couple of collections, books. One is called Architecture and Labour, and another one called Architecture and Capitalism, which is a collection of essays. And there's another one as well. I can't remember the name of it. All of which are focused in various ways about trying to understand or bring to the forefront more the question of how it is that we properly account for and value the labor of architecture, and in and of itself, but also as it relates to other parts of the construction industry, notably the site, but also other parts, I guess, the extended realm of construction. So I think everything that she does is sort of sits in that territory, and clearly there's somewhere in there there's a background looking. She refers back to Marx a lot, and I think that Peter Drucker book that she references in this text, the one about the post-capitalist, blah blah blah, whatever it's called, the one I mean. She's trying to make an argument that there is a way in which basically the workers can take control of the means production. I suppose that's what she's kind of maybe aiming for. And then in this piece that we read, I suppose what's interesting is that she sees BIM not as the enemy of, as potentially liberatory force, actually, because it somehow necessitates a different kind of accounting for time and work than the sort of norms of, let's say, design-led activity in offices, which I kind of found interesting. I thought that was an interesting insight in the piece, but I don't know whatever anyone else thought. I just wanted to put it in there because it sort of felt like it took some of the things we were already talking about and bring it in a new direction.
Yeah,
really glad I read it. So anyone else?
I suppose, like, to echo what you said, like the interview, I feel almost has more interesting insights than the actual piece itself. Like, for one, it's quite short. Like the piece is quite short, and I suppose in that sense it's kind of hard to perhaps construct in-depth arguments that tear things apart. But to be honest, I don't really see where she was going with this idea of BIM being this liberatory force. Like, one thing she said at one point was, like, because BIM and people who work around BIM are so, like, knowledge based, and their work is very knowledge heavy and not necessarily seen as design, although the thing that she's arguing is that it's an integral part of the design. But she says at one point that what was it? The way that this represents the workers actually owning the means of production that is knowledge itself, because what they're producing is knowledge, and like the input is knowledge and the output is knowledge. And I don't know. I felt like the arguments that she was putting together, it didn't really feel like it was achieving what she says at the start. Like this thing where she says a real like how she opens up the piece with it saying that like there's a real shift that needs to happen, something fundamental needs to change. I didn't feel like she was really commenting on anything fundamental within architecture, like especially this idea of BIM. Like it just feels like BIM like is kind of just a technological development, and that all of the stuff that's happening around BIM within the architectural field is just the industry responding to technology, which seems pretty much to be the status quo. Like that happened with CAD, and she says that outright in the piece as well. So I don't know if anybody else has thoughts. That they're my initial thoughts, though.
What did anyone else think?
I guess I kind of agree. I agree with Steph, I think, a little bit, that I wanted to see her argument that there might be some way to upset the power hierarchy in the office by pursuing, by seeing the potentials in BIM, but I don't really think that it's a possibility. I think, like so many of the other things that have occurred in offices in the past, you know, the people who acquire the knowledge, the BIM knowledge, the CAD knowledge, whatever it is, the technology knowledge, the people with most of the knowledge about how buildings get built end up in the back office, and the people with the influence and the inability, but the the contacts end up in the front and meeting the clients. And I think it's a tougher nut to crack than she's suggesting. Quite apart from anything else, I think with stuff like BIM, I mean, she's writing, sort of about 2015, I think this is, and I read a couple of other things, and I think, I want to agree with her, and I agree with most of her analysis, and I found it very interesting, I must say. But I think that with something like BIM, the user interface changes next week or the week after, and suddenly lots of people can use it. Like they can use like a little kitchen design software that you download, and you design your own kitchen, and then the technological advantage is lost, and we've moved on to the next thing. So, and I mean, I think there is a little bit of a sense at the minute in the industry, in the game, that maybe we've sort of slightly crested the BIM thing, and now we're moving on to whatever Grasshopper and Rhino is doing and where that's taking us, and we've moved on a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of thought that the potential interest in it is that BIM carries with it everything, always. You know what I mean? It's incredibly data heavy, and notionally BIM can bring time and space and actually labor with it, cost, obviously. So 5D BIM is time plus money plus 3D. So looked at negatively, which is really easy, it's like that's an incredibly that seems to constrain every single, let's say, parameter, every possible scope for invention within a building is already managed out of existence. Looked at positively, maybe it makes visible all the connections that are often elided or want to be made invisible in a design process. The consequences of things, the cost of things, the time of things, the mess of things. Do you know what I mean? That it's sort of, by making it always present. I sort of thought that that's what she was saying. That like there's an interesting counterpoint to it, which is Mark, I'm sure will know Sergio Ferro, the Portuguese Brazilian architect who writes a lot about the site and labor on site. And he's saying that design is a fiction, that the design process is a fiction that cuts the labor out of it deliberately. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't think about effort. It doesn't think about work in those terms. But so maybe what BIM does is to put it back in. And that's why designers hate it, because it's laborious, to put it that way.
Yeah.
But maybe that's possibly and I have to say I wouldn't know where to start. I don't know anything about BIM, but it's just I just find it interesting as it potentially shifts the terms on which people can work in architecture. Do you know?
Yeah. And that was kind of the thing that she was saying, like that BIM can sort of act as a synthesizing force. Like I can't remember the exact quote, but it was talking about she mentioned how I think I actually have it written down, something about like the design process being this illogical, unquantifiable thing, and the actual construction process being the opposite, wants to be logical, quantifiable, etc. Now I think in terms of labor relations, it certainly can. I can see where she's coming from, that can act as a synthesizing force, like synthesizing the design, so the designer with the people who are actually going to build the architecture, like that's something that she was saying in the interview as well. So I sort of see where she's coming from that point of view, but I think it also leaves out the fact that BIM, in a way, I don't want to say it dilutes architecture, but like it sort of diverges away from, I don't know, the things that can't be quantified, like this idea of quality, which is what I thought architecture was supposed to do, like this idea of imagining the quality of space, the quality of experience. Like that's not something that you can necessarily capture in BIM, and I think that's what the architecture field exists for.
Well, it goes back to Hannes Meyer, doesn't it? Like Hannes Meyer in the Bauhaus, building times economy is architecture.
What was the equation?
Building times economy.
Well, yes, I think, Steph, you've gotten near to it there. I mean, David Harvey has a line, I think it's him, who says, he talks about accumulation by dispossession of skills in his analysis of industrial production. That industrial capitalism grew out of craft manufacturing, pre-industrial production. And it strove to replace craft workers, skilled workers, with unskilled workers. The drive of industrial capitalism has been towards replacing precisely non-quantifiable multitude skills which are required over many generations. And to replace those with things that don't, because skilled labor is so much more expensive than unskilled labor. So to substitute a machine for all of the things that a craft worker has acquired through a complex experience of socialization and so on. And you can see in the bureaucratic environment, in offices, you can see this same accumulation by dispossession of skill through the organization using computers of office work. So what had been done in original, older, earlier forms of offices has been simplified greatly by the introduction of computers. And the question about BIM is, in its attempt to quantify all parts of the building design and management process, is it really just going to be another form of de-skilling in order to quantify labor, in order to maximize productivity? Now, I would take a big exception to a sentence in her article, which says that while Das Kapital seems antithetical to American management, the goal for both is the same, i.e. the creative, supported, cooperative, satisfied and productive worker.
I thought you would. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had to read that a few times because, okay, without, and I mentioned it's the same goal as the successful BIM manager. I mean, obviously, apart from just sniggering, how you respond to that is to go, well, actually, the goal of American management is the productive worker. And the goal of capital is the creative, supportive, cooperative, satisfied worker owner. The goal of capital is replacing the worker per se with the worker who owns, who in other words, who benefits, not alienated from the profits created by their work. And I don't see how her analysis is therefore anything other than petty bourgeois or what Marx would have called bourgeois socialism, which is an attempt to somehow or other ameliorate the conditions of labour without addressing the fundamental division between labour and
Yeah.
owner.
There's another thing I think that came up somewhere around that sentence that you just read out, where she talks about wanting to refer to the BIM manager not necessarily as a manager but as a craftsperson. And it's something that I would like to unpack, because I don't really like, I kind of understand what she meant by it, like sort of deconstructing the notion of the manager, or almost like increasing the importance of the BIM manager to be something more than just a petty manager.
I think she was using it deliberately to anticipate Marx's response to, or not Marx, like Marx's response, as in, like, situate the BIM manager as the kind of ideal, the sort of pre-industrial craft person, because I think she was doing it also as a sort of provocation to say that in fact the management of BIM, as in its current form, involves, you know, anticipating accidents, working with different kinds of people. It's not an automated. It hasn't panned out in this way of being, you know, contributing to the kind of, what would you say? Well, the deskilling, the making things more automized, if that's the word. Etc. That's what I take it to mean. I mean, James Russo, case in point, you know, James Russo here is not my picture of what a BIM manager is, except he is one, you know.
I think to that point though, like, she is recognizing that BIM management takes a lot of skill, which I don't know if any of us actually disagree with. Like, yes, it does take a lot of skill, and she's outlined that very clearly. Like, there's so many aspects of that role that exist. However, if you have a successful BIM manager, one that is this craftsperson that she is describing, that then would facilitate this idea of deskilling, because if you have a successful BIM manager, well, that's somebody who can successfully divide the tasks that need to be done such that anybody can do them.
Yeah.
The best description ever of, hold on for a second, I'll just hold on to your thought, in the sense that this is only a little tiny thing, but the best description ever of accumulation by dispossession of skills is the account of how the two McDonalds brothers invented their way of producing food in the late 50s or the mid 50s. They ended up getting trumped by that guy Ray Kroc, who turned it into a big business venture based on property. But they invented this idea that instead of teaching anyone how to cook, let's say how to cook a hamburger, all you have to do is set up a series of procedures that anyone could do with 1 hour's training, so that each part of the process can be done by somebody with simply an hour's training. That was a huge move forward in producing food, because up to that point, all food had to be produced by somebody whose training was very expensive, who'd taken a long time to get to that point.
But Mark, what do you think about the argument that by somehow making apparent all the dimensions of and components of a system of production, right? Say production of buildings, that in itself can be I don't want to say can be a liberation. It's not that, but it can somehow be an act of a supportive act, or a
demystification of the relations of production. Yeah, I mean, that is very important in architecture, because architecture suffers from the idea that the architect is an undivided phenomenon, and that there aren't any worker architects. That there's this idea that, you know, we all go to college, we train, and we want to become this thing called an architect. And even in the RIAI's, you know, charter, good practice guide, or whatever, there's very little description of code of practice. There's very little description of worker relationships within architecture. With the fact is that the actual, I mean, I see architecture producing, I mean, from a very, very hard Marxist point of view, architecture has a number of functions. For instance, managing building contracts, which is basically, we're managers of capital, administering building contracts for the benefit of capital, and maximizing property value by putting property land through building regulations and planning. And all of that maximization of property value is done by graduates and students. It's all that labour of all those endless numbers of documents that have to be produced to process land through the regulatory process. And for what purpose? Always for maximising its value, for increasing its value under this state regulatory system of building and planning control. And again, back to Marx and Engels, who said that the modern state is a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. I think you never see this more clearly than in the case of that whole planning industrial complex that Frank McDonald's be talking about. That whole notion of taking a piece of land and instantly multiplying its value. And architects do that work. And wage earning architects are the ones who do all the labour of that. As Gary says, in the front of house, you've got the capital, if you like, the people with the social capital who are able to bring that business in and do those deals and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, Mark, architects also build schools and hospitals and things like that.
Good point. Yeah.
It would not be more the case that developers do that. I feel like architects don't get to do that much at all. And like maximize value and stuff, have the impact that way. I feel like we're kind of facilitated by what developers are doing.
Well, that's true. We're
Tony Ronan type of people.
Yeah, but Tom, well, that's true. And there have been architect developers, and they're not uncommon. John Nash apparently in London was, but as Tom's point is, yes, architects can also build schools and hospitals and houses and social housing and so on. So that has always to be, but in one sense, we're always maximizing the value of land.
Yeah, I think, Mark, though, that I agree with Tom. You know, we do all of these things. You know, we build nice little churches and creches and so on. But the market rate, the market value, the social capital of the architect is established by the relationship with the developer, because the developer drives the market. It's certainly in Ireland anyway. You know, that's where all the big projects are. That's where the money gets spent. And for me, I think it's. I mean, I thought Deamer's piece was. I mean, it was very interesting. But I always, in my mind, I keep coming back to this very poisonous relationship between the architect and the developer client, which I think is really quite special in a capitalist economy. It's not the same as the doctor's relationship with the patient or the banker's relationship with whoever. The one between the architect and the developer is very particular. Because of the enormous amounts of money that developers can make in pursuing what it is that they do, and the lengths that they will go to maximize that return, and the lack of, I suppose, value or respect that's placed on the architect's role in this. This tends to, in my view, it sort of establishes a kind of a rate, if you like, a scale. And what that means ultimately is that if you're working as an architect, I'm sure Tom, Mark is practicing as well. Like, you know, you're familiar with the fact that you know, you'll be working on a project and there might be 7 or 8 other different consultants on board. You're doing twice as much work. You're taking twice as much responsibility. You're writing twice as many minutes. You take it in the neck every time something goes wrong. And you're working for way, way less than the kitchen consultant and the conservation consultant and everybody else. Now, I think that no amount of analysis on Deamer's part as to how you can explain, you know, the sort of the Marxist element of what's going on here gets over the fact that we can do nothing about it until we change the position that we are with regard to developer client. And that's, I think the problem lies there. And I certainly don't think that our institute does anything enough to address that issue. You know? Sorry, Hugh.
No, I'm just saying that in the interview, which gives, I guess, insight into more of her work, which I did think doesn't tend to focus so much on this relationship to client. It's actually the internal workings of the architecture profession that are of interest to her, where she's saying that it's bound up with like this thing of undervaluing of ourself, because we don't think it's a profession, we think it's a calling, and therefore everyone buys into that, and everybody you're supposed to buy into that, and so therefore you're not supposed to properly value your time relative to somebody else's time. there's an assumption, and often that's happening in pursuit of terribly noble built projects, including schools and hospitals and public housing. So that the actual way that it operates is also, and then and she talks about, you can imagine her in Yale, because like Yale is full of the other type of the big egos in the room as well. So I can imagine that there was a very, that's a very contrarian stance, I would have thought. Eisenman et al. Or Robert Stern or whoever it is. So there's a bit of that, isn't there? I that's what I thought was like. I thought that chimed with quite a lot of what the Gary Stevens stuff, Mark. Again, she's talking about this idea of priesthood. She's talking about this idea of.
Yeah, and Gary, I would disagree with a distinction that you've made between working for a developer and working for anybody else. Just from a Marxist and analytical point of view, I think all clients are developers. We must regard, I'm thinking of the least developer-like project I can think of is that church. I went to see it with you, Tom, with the Bruder Klaus Kapelle, which Peter Zumthor did for nothing for some monk, in the field and so on. But that guy's a developer. We must consider all client-architect relationships as a developer, whether it's a social democratic state, commissioning schools.
Mark, Peter Zumthor no doubt had 3 interns working on that project for nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure.
Exactly. And in fact, when the other year, my friend Mark went to the RIA conference and he came back and told me that somebody from Foster Associates came and presented a Maggie Centre. You understand, you know what I'm talking about. They presented a Maggie Centre that they designed. And I was reminded of a description once of some type of Dutch painting where the point of view was always very low with the giant cow right in front of the viewer, so that you didn't see anything behind it because there weren't any mountains in Holland. This was the only way that this painter could produce large objects, was to go right up close to a cow at very low. And I thought of the tiny little, 20 square meter, 50 square meter Maggie Centre was foregrounded at this presentation, completely obscuring the 100,000 square meters of office space that Foster and Associates are producing every 20 minutes, or whatever scale at which they're producing. And I'm not saying that all of that work isn't, wonderful and whatever. It's just that idea of a developer as the bad guy is kind of become part of our lexicon, and we should more correctly think of all production as being capital, whatever it is, even that little monk who gets the free job. Some form of capital is being invested or put into, no matter whether it's with what we would regard as a good intention or a purely profiteering intention. We are always looking at production, we're always looking at our role in that production.
That's the thing about the Maggie Centres, is they're done without a fee. They're done pro bono. Yep. So by their nature, they can only be undertaken by certain kinds of practices that either have the scale or the unpaid labour, actually, that will do it for them.
Yeah, and they're almost by definition pointing to a flaw in society, that if we have to do these things by charity, well, something's wrong with our democracy. That we're not able to, provide for these things that are necessary. Yeah. But Mark, I do think there is something quite particular about, I don't think that for the average person, if they're working in a factory or wherever, or whatever it is that they do, I don't think we should have to expect them to, to pick, to go back to Marx, maybe to sort of think where am I going wrong? I'm not able to make a living, or, my time is being abused. That typically for most people, I think, participating in society, there can be a sense, perhaps, they may feel a sense of injustice about, how much they get paid or how much they're valued, how much they're worth. But I think there is something particular about the architect's position. I think it's something to do with the fact that even at the largest size, like an architect's company, like if they employ 500 people, they're very big. That may be SAP or not SAP, SOM or something like that. But in terms of like another organization, like the gammas or whatever, it's only a fraction of the population. So they never have the kind of clout in the place to be able to exert their presence. And I think that, when we're working for a client, a developer client, it's always on a scale. We're trying to get 10% out of a 13% overall fee, which is not the way most people operate. And I think when you're in that kind of a situation, it's always a race to the bottom. And I do think there's something particular about our situation that makes it just a little bit outside the sort of the normative and Marxist analysis of the relation of the worker to the production of capital, I think.
Yeah, Tom is about to say something, but Gary, just my problem with using developer is always picking the bad guy there is because it takes you out, it makes you think that the problem is the egregious capital, is the grabbing, the bad guy. Rather than a Marxist analysis is really just to look at relations of production, whatever they may be, and to be relatively dispassionate about them. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I was kind of agreeing with a lot of what was just been said there, but just what's interesting about this article or the article and the interview, I think, is to think back about the model itself, or the model of practice, or a couple of models of practice that are kind of a little bit problematic, and that's kind of brought to the fore when you think about them with respect to BIM. Like, Gary, you refer to this kind of front of office, back of office kind of structure, which is a sort of problematic model in itself, and it just becomes even more so than with BIM. And then you've got the this kind of lionized, or at least often lionized, this kind of single operator type, the kind of Peter Carl calls them the strong silent type, I think, who which is a completely economically kind of unviable model almost, and even more so with BIM. You can't even afford to buy the software, so I think where it becomes kind of interesting is to think about what she starts talking about. Then the second part is structures of offices that are much more cooperative oriented or collaboratives, and then coming back from that point of view to think about BIM, the role of BIM then within that kind of scenario, and that means kind of a scenario where you're rethinking the design process itself from scratch, to think about how a project is financed, and that's a design element. How a project is governed and structured, that's a design element as well. We can bring that into the process. So in that sense, it becomes, in that scenario rather, it becomes a tool which you can deploy rather than something that's going to kind of concretize existing problems or existing hierarchies in an office, I think.
Do any of the students on the panel have experience of working with BIM or any offices that's relevant to all of these issues? Owen?
I just remember having to use it for my third year project for an assignment and hating it because of all its limitations. Like you can only use all these like standardized elements that you have to like either use just the ones that are in the software or try and find them online, or really laboriously make them yourself. So it's not fun to use, and it's definitely not, it doesn't feel like a design tool. But I do think it could. Then from my experience, I worked in an office and we didn't use BIM, and then all I could think of it was how great it would be if we did use it, because it would just help so much with kind of standardizing on through drawing packages, and like certain errors of like plans not lining up with sections just wouldn't happen. But no, not that much experience yet. I think it could be good, but it's not embraced very much in Ireland yet.
Although, I mean, yeah, it's not even by larger practices.
We're really getting there. Yeah, definitely. The bigger offices we're really getting there. Yeah. Sorry, Hugh.
Like I'm currently involved in a project in UCD, right, that's going to be built. And there's an executive architect there, the big commercial firm, and the making of the BIM model is something entirely separate to the design whatever the design stages as you're moving through them. So it is.
There's
I think
actually,
Because
sorry, I know as well that a lot of Irish architecture firms basically farm out the BIM work to countries such as India and South Africa. So basically, a BIM model is made there and then shared with the office. But yeah, totally
Yeah.
divorced. So yeah, that happened where I worked.
And then
I think, Owen, I think that's where we're going. Actually.
it comes into its own as a management tool. Then that's what happens. You run the contract using it. That's the idea. So it's a project manager.
Just to return to the Marxist analysis, that this guy Drucker seems to be part of that kind of tradition of, I think, thinking that there's a massive change in the composition of capital because mainly office work is done in Western cities now, and that therefore we are moved from production of objects into production of knowledge. This is the line. And I think that was a great mistake to think that that's a fundamental difference. I mean, this coincides with manufacturing moving to cheaper labor markets and the Western sphere becoming increasingly bureaucratized. But we have to think about what's going on in these places as relations of production, either way, and that profit is being made through increasing productivity by whatever means. That's why it's important always, I think, to take the slightly, if you like, antagonistic or competitive view between workers and owners, always, 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 because the owner, she's not right to think that the American management they want productive workers, but they only want them to be supported and cooperative and satisfied insofar as it increases productivity. So that's what Marx would have called bourgeois socialism, which is the socialism, which is like Owenism, which is the point of which, like social democracy generally. And by the way, that may be the best that can be hoped for. And maybe that is the ideal, because it seems like it now, after 40 years of laissez-faire retrenchment or neoliberal retrenchment, but that these are just strategies for increasing production. A bit like, Google workers being allowed to stay on Friday night and have a beer and play pool. I got that feeling from our article, that BIM was going to somehow or other replace hierarchies and antagonisms with networks. Yeah. This is a great term about somehow networks will level everything out. A Marxist will always look back to who's getting a profit from this and whose labor is contributing to that profit, always in an exploitative arrangement.
And that's like precisely the thing that Owen said, like this idea that like BIM almost allows offices now to farm out and exploit labor in cheaper labor markets. My dad is a product manager for a telecoms company, or his previous job specifically this applies to, because one of the things that they always did was farm out the labor to places like India, where it was a whole lot cheaper. Actually, the company that he's working for currently does pretty much the same thing, because all of their employees are employed as contractors, not employees. So the company only has like 3 employees, but it's got like over 1,000 people actually working for it. And the reason why they do that is so that they can manage the labor, so they can manage it, like basically find the best labor, and they work on this global scale. So they have people from Eastern Europe, they have people from Southeast Asia, they have people from all over who are employed on the same contract basis, all because of this technology, which allows them to work and manage that like all remotely. So like I suppose BIM in this sense allows the same thing to happen in the architectural profession. So it's almost clear to me that like the opposite is true from what Deamer is arguing, like this idea that it can equalize the relations of production. Arguably, no, it may seem to equalize the relations of production in a certain office, but that doesn't fundamentally mean the relations of labor are equal. It's like this notion that like we're a classless society in the West, like everybody's middle class in the West, but that's not true. It's a false what's the word? I don't know.
That's partly because of that's reinforced by let's say the hierarchies that we establish within within architecture which say that the concept is the stuff that's worth something, and the window schedule is not, or the door schedule is not, or it is in another way, right? Of course, but so as long as we perpetuate that, then we will continue to think of BIM as being something that can go on as being in the back room or some other.
I feel like she kind of was hinting that it will eventually lead to workers in the kind of lower ranks of the firm having more autonomy and power. Because right now there's a disconnect. None of the kind of senior architects know how to use it, and all the younger ones do. But eventually that won't be the case.
Yeah. Well, no, I was more thinking along the lines that Tom was outlining, that, and I know that Marxists are suspicious of networks, but there was some promise in that idea of a more open matrix established, where we were more alert to, and whereby because creativity is the lure, isn't it? The idea of the creativity is happening somewhere else, but couldn't creativity happen through the sort of conscious manipulation of this matrix stuff in terms of, let's say, construction processes, let's say, or I don't know, more actually in terms of things to do with embodied energy or tracing the costs of things and where they're coming from, all of that stuff, seems to me. I mean, like, it is interesting that at the same time I was reading Keel Mao, if you know him, who writes a lot about
who again?
Keel Mao. He really writes about energy in building as terrestrial activity, and tries to understand he has a book about the Seagram building where he kind of unpacks the whole energy story of that building, if you like. But what's interesting actually is that he's using a very data heavy mode of analysis to explode the sort of abstract tendencies of architecture, you know what I mean, to undermine the claims of that building or of the architecture of that building, by saying, actually, no, sorry, the facts are it's got more concrete in it than bronze. It doesn't have any bronze in it. It's all brass. That comes from over here. It took this amount of production to bring it in. You know, there's underdevelopment going on over there in order to develop that here. And you can't do that without, that's what I'm saying about bringing everything into view, making it visible. I can't remember the word, Mark, the better word, but anyway, making all of that stuff evident and pointing to it, naming it, can be is very bracing for architecture, because we don't like to, well, first of all, we don't really know what to do with it. Like, what is it that we should do, given all of that, you know, like, because the usual acts that we have, the design acts that we have, seem inadequate relative to it, you know?
Yeah, that was something that I was thinking about as well. Like, if we lay out all of this data in front of us and we have more data, it's like, okay, how do you then interpret that? Like, one of the things that one of my brother's lecturers said to him when he was in first or second year and first being introduced to CAD, he studies engineering, he was told by his lecturer not to use any of the modeling features, i.e. like flow models, to look at like airflow over things, because you won't know how to interpret them, and data in the hands of people who don't know how to interpret that data is incredibly dangerous. Like, for one thing, you have the issues of misinformation. I suppose this is much broader, and then there's also the fact that data is arguably integral to capital. And if ultimately you want to move away from a capitalistic idea of architecture, and one that serves a wider social good, then BIM certainly isn't the answer in that sense.
Actually, sorry. Yeah, Steph, I think that you've really got close to this now, because there seems to be two things. One is, Hugh is suggesting a few times now, that Peggy Deamer's analysis can help us, and it really does help us to analyze. It takes apart things that were all together and a bit fuzzy. So a quantification process can, and like the one you mentioned just there about energy and so on, can help us to be analytical, to be more properly structural, I suppose, in our analysis. But the other side of that is commodification, when we take things that are qualities and they turn them into quantities. which is the key to producing things for sale,
Yeah.
producing things for a market, for profit. And it seems to be these are always the two potentials of the cybernetic, certainly, is both the analytical potential, in that information is brought out and made, if you like, things are made equal so that we can start to see them, but also the potential of this commodification of labour, that by simply breaking it up into smaller and smaller quantifiable units, which therefore can be traded and profited from in the strictly exchange value rather than use value. Just remembered, I saw Owen Hatherley the other night at a conference organised by the Morning Star in England, the communist newspaper, about housing. And he just spoke about housing local authorities over the last decades in the UK, different ones who've done good social housing, and his point being that they don't have to reinvent social housing. It's, that's already been figured out. It's a question of the political conditions. But he again talked about the use value. That's what it is. I mean, that's what architecture is involved in, as well as maximizing exchange value. It's always involved in producing use value, almost inevitably producing use value.
How do you mean by producing use value?
I mean, producing something that's nice to be in, or something that keeps you dry, or something everything that makes your life materially or even spiritually, intellectually enriched. Everything that feeds you, that makes your life more meaningful, is a use for you, if it works for you. And an exchange value is just how much money something is. That's the fundamental kind of economic.
Is the architect responsible for creating that use value, or is the builder responsible for creating that use value? Because that was something that I've been thinking about as well during this. Is there's different sort of modes of production. Like I suppose a big question is, what is the thing that the architect actually produces? Because in one sense, okay, we produce buildings, but like in a higher sense, we produce drawings. That's what we produce. Like, we produce designs. We don't actually produce the buildings.
Well, it's a key role, and I give you an example that came to mind the other day, because we did a project with engineers, and I was reading an interview with Peter Rice from the 80s, and I've been quoting this non-stop for the last 2 days, but Peter Rice in this interview with Martin Pauly 40 years ago now said, or 30 years ago said, that when he was making those giant connectors in the Boburg, the Gerberits, he decided to cast them, because he was thinking of what he learned from Jorn Utzon working in Sydney about making giant structures a human scale. And it all came down to that sense of what it would be like to be beside a giant thing. So he thought he'd cast them and polish, like round them out. And if you know the building, you know what he means, that even though this is a giant thing, it doesn't feel alienated. You don't feel that it's part of a different world. He made it part of your world. And he does that through intuition or a sense or training or imagination, whatever you want to call it. And that's a real use value. The exchange value is always just reducing things to how much money they are worth. And these two things are always in play in all economics. It's Adam Smith who first introduced this distinction. Architecture is involved with both of these things all the time.
Yeah, but I don't like it's almost so you're saying that every architectural project is involved in both of these things.
That's why I was going to Gary and saying we should think of all architecture as development in that strict sense, that it's all about producing some value. Some of that's going to be use value, some of it's going to be exchange value. So, but because it's embedded in production and the economy, there's always this element of exchange value. Unless it's something you did for your granny, unless it's something you did as a gift for a friend, unless it's something outside of exchange, then it produces some exchange value. It adds to the GDP. It
still produces exchange value, though, arguably, even if you give it away, because it's creating something that somebody else can then go on and sell.
Well, I saw a cartoon in some magazine recently where a little girl standing on the chair in the kitchen, and her granny has just produced an enormous cake. You might have seen it, and the little girl goes, "Granny, that's such a beautiful cake you've produced, but unfortunately you have no social media presence, so there's no point." We all kind of know exactly what this is about.
Before we go, or
Yeah.
remind me, I do have a very good BIM story, which I'm told is true,
Go for
and
it.
I'm told relates to a popular Irish office. Will I relate it now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I will. So
As long as you name names, Gary, we only allow names.
I won't name that. They'll rhyme with names. You'll get it.
We can put the link in the bio to the office.
The office, well, put it this way, the office is in a county that's famous for playing hurling. That's as far as I'm going to go. So that should be enough. So anyway, there was this young gentleman who was the BIM manager in this office, and they were doing a very big project. I think the biggest project at the time, probably the biggest project in the state, and it was going to tender next Friday. And the BIM manager was in charge of all of this, and he was working absolutely furiously trying to get the whole thing together for tender. And he heard on the grapevine that as soon as the job was going out to tender, he was going to be let go. He was going to be released from the office. So he worked furiously to get the job to go to tender at 5 o'clock on Friday evening. And he sent it out to tender, the most beautifully put together BIM package you've ever seen in your life. But he also hit the button to fill this model with 10 billion forks before it went out to tender, so that he destroyed the entire model. Yeah, and I do understand, I believe it's, and I'm sure that's exaggerated, but I believe there's a grain of truth in it. And it was a very large project, and it upset the whole tender process and delayed everything. Now, the newspapers reported on the delay in the process, but didn't say why. But I believe that this was the case.
That's the old breakers. That's going back to Ned Ludd and the breakers, who, and this is another aspect of this that we didn't mention, that accompanying the industrial movement at the early stages, as you all know, people went and broke machines to try and protect their traditional forms of production, and they're now called Luddites. And it was the first time that the British government introduced a statutory crime of criminal damage and viciously punished people. Like, people were hanged for this, for these attacks in the early 19th century. And because of the seriousness to the new economy that all of this was. Prior to that, the only common law offence of criminal damage was arson, because traditionally that was the only thing that would have been a threat to European society of that kind of activity. But that's just pure Luddism in the traditional sense there, Gary. Sabotage.
I think
the word saboteur comes from the French for clog, which is sabot.
Oh, really? Okay.
It comes from the fact that the workers threw their clogs into the machines.
Brilliant. That's great.
Cool.
When was it, Tom? When does it come from?
I don't know. But
Brilliant.
I think it must be about the same time as.
Brilliant. I love it. Saboteurs.
I do think, just to get back to something there that Steph brought up, I think there is something, I can't quite put my finger on it to explain it precisely, but I do think that in the broader Marxist discussion about the production, the making of art, whatever you want to call it, the production of architecture, that there is something that is there's something that just there's a sort of a variable that won't define itself as X in this equation, which is that I think there is an element of uncertainty a lot of the time about what the architect is doing. So that if you, for example, take just a topical situation like Johnny Ronan's Two Towers in Dublin, I find it difficult to understand, what the value of this is or what it might be. And I can't really put my finger on the criteria that needs to be used to justify the architect's participation. And I do think that lack of certainty sometimes, both in sort of very commercial architecture, but also I think in, some of the architecture that takes itself very seriously and has over the past, say, 20, 30 years, that it can be deconstructed or ultra tectonic or ultra energy efficient or whatever, that whenever there is a kind of an ism about the production of architecture, it's sometimes it's, you know, I find it difficult in my own mind really to resolve, well, what is the architect's participation in this value making? And I do think that there is something that maybe architects need to do to come back to and say, well, we need to sort of redefine what it is that we're doing here. I think that's part of the debate too. I think, I don't know, I haven't explained it very well, but it flashes across my mind from time to time when this kind of debate comes up. And I suddenly find myself trying to figure out, is there a way to somehow justify or stand up and speak on behalf of the BIM manager who is working in Henry J. Lyons, who is working on this project for Johnny Ronan, and I hit some sort of point where I'm not able to go any further. I say, oh, I'll pick a different example. This one isn't working for me.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something that I've thought about as well, like this idea, like what exactly, like I said previously, like what exactly is it that architects produce? And I think it's something that architects in general, like the field, even has trouble defining. Like I think both internally and externally, like the idea of architecture is so fundamentally entrenched with the idea of buildings that I don't think it necessarily does justice to the skill set that we learn both in our educational process and throughout the career. Like this idea of visualizing information and communicating things, like that to me seems something more fundamental to architecture than merely the idea of buildings. And I suppose if you begin to rethink and redefine what exactly it is that architecture is, that architects do, people in this profession do, well then you come to this idea of like what we could do is more broader. And I think like it comes back to something that I said I think previously in one of these things as well, like we perhaps need to reimagine how we apply our skill set if we want to do the things that ultimately a lot of people claim to want to do. Like if we want to be more socially conscious and do things that are more socially conscious, well then we can't simply continue to practice the way in which we currently do. Like maybe it is we need to apply our skill sets in a different way.
Or embrace BIM more so that architects are more central to the construction process again. You know?
Yeah.
Or think about cooperatives. You know, I mean, think about different structures for practice, collaboratives, multidisciplinary structures,
co-op structures and so on.
Yeah, you know, because that's where the answer is really, I think. Because if you just think you have to have this kind of certain economic model or fit into this type of practice that's been going on for forever, then you're just going to end up having to feed that model, you know. So I think you need to maybe think about different types of models and different types of approaches to practice.